thought experiment. Okay? So the first thing I'd like you to do is think about where you are today. So you were accepted in Stanford. You are in the middle of your education. Now I'm going to ask how many of you think that you got into Stanford, don't raise your hand yet, because of your intelligence, your SAT scores, your AP scores, your effort. And how many of you think that you got in because of external factors, your family, your parents' education, wealth, and class? So if you think you got in because you got the smarts and you did the work, raise your hand. And how many of you think you got in because of external factors? Okay. So I'm going to ask you to keep that in mind as we go through this. Okay, and so I'm going to present the fact that if you haven't ever thought of it, education is a way of preserving advantage in this country. And I'm also asking you to look at funding and look at schools as a function of the communities that they live in, that they're located in, and as a function of what society is willing to invest in that particular community's education and future. And I'm also going to present this in the context of the Tinsley program, which is a program that I've talked in the past about, and it's been a program instituted to basically highlight the disparities in education between Palo Alto School District and East Palo Alto, which is just across the freeway. Okay, and then I'm going to suggest a remedy for that particular program. So as I said, the Tinsley project was a project of a lawsuit that was brought in 1986 against the Palo Alto School District because East Palo Alto was significantly underfunded in comparison to Palo Alto, at the tune of $120 per pupil in East Palo Alto and $1,200 up to $4,000 per pupil in the Palo Alto School District. And this is primarily due to partnerships with the Palo Alto School District with parents, where parents can make direct contributions to the school to pay for instruction, as well as to pay separately for supplies. Both of these are nonprofit organizations and nonprofit funds, which means they don't get taxed. In addition to that, they make partnerships with different corporations, which can provide funding, and they can provide computers, they can provide technology, they can also provide services such as having researchers, engineers come into the classroom, and that's difficult to quantify monetarily. However, it is an asset to Palo Alto School District. Okay, I'm going to talk about something that I brought up before, which is the Bronfenbrenner model. And I think that when we talk in the context of education, sometimes there's a limited perspective as to what actually affects the student. And we think of school being the primary factor that affects the child's success. But in reality, the child's sex, age, health, intelligence is what makes up the individual. And this individual is going to be affected by his family, his school, his peers, his community, his neighbors, and indirectly through politics and the school board and funding. But all of these are going to affect that child's success. So it's always within context. And I think when you talk about education reform, you tend to focus on just, for example, one aspect like teacher credentialing, value-added methods, different programs, vouchers, alternatives, when in reality it's much more complex. It's a part of our social structure. I looked at a study looking at risk factors and behavior problems for children as an indicator of how well they were going to do once they got into kindergarten. I read that children from lower socioeconomic households are about twice as likely as those from high socioeconomic households to display inattention, a lack of persistence, disinterest, non-cooperation, or frustration as he or she completed a series of cognitive and physical tasks with a non-caregiver, which would be what he or she would be doing in a school setting, which is largely attributable susceptible to the effects of having a mother with a low education level. So I asked you, if you thought that you were here because of your intelligence and your effort. And a lot of studies are focusing on academia, and a lot of policies are being explored as far as early childhood education, and they are realizing that parent education is a huge determinant as far as how far that child will go. Okay, there's a professor here at Stanford. His name is Lebery, and he actually published a book this past year, and it goes through the idea that someone has to fail. That's the title of the book. So it explores the idea that in the United States, we believe in open access to education, but we don't believe in equal education. We believe in stratification of education. There are different spheres, different rungs in education. And he argues that the one higher education that is easily accessible to all communities is community education, community college education. However, that's going to bring about the least increase in your social status, the least increase, less impact as far as advancement. The education's research universities that actually can provide you with a huge change and advantage socially and economically are very difficult to get into. And you have to display things such as accomplishments. For example, it could be piano lessons, gymnastics, leadership skills, travel, academics, which is, of course, related to your effort, but sometimes is also a function of tutoring, and is also a function of how much effort your parents, who might have several degrees amongst them, have been able to invest in you. So it's not quite as simple as just your effort alone. Okay, so if you take a step back and not just look at education, socioeconomic status has been tied to educational outcomes, health outcomes, and life course outcomes. Things such as longevity and quality of life. So you know that I come from a health background. And in health, we cannot look at a patient without understanding context. You cannot make a recommendation for a patient unless you understand what their limitations and what their daily life is like. You cannot ask them to exercise 5 times a week and eat a particular diet unless you know that perhaps their income is limited and they might not be able to afford certain things. Perhaps they work 2 jobs, and as they get off of work, they rush to pick up their kids and get food for them. The kids are crying in the back of the car, and this person possibly didn't have a chance to go grocery shopping, so they swing by McDonald's. The day ends fairly quickly, and they didn't get a chance to exercise. So if you don't understand that lifestyle, and you don't target that lifestyle, you're not going to make any changes. All you're doing is providing abstract information. And so in health, what you do is you look at the patient and you realize that the patient's health is a function of what their childhood health was, which in turn was influenced by their family's health and well-being. And this is influenced by their living and working conditions and their social and economic opportunities. And it's a cycle. Okay? There's a researcher who looked at the Tinsley program, and she did her dissertation in 2008. And one thing that stood out more than anything in the 200-page dissertation was this, that the children who participate in the Tinsley program are effectively having to negotiate 2 different societies, 2 different worlds that don't interact on a daily basis. Their parents don't have to do this. The children have to do this. They come from a background where they may not have access to the same resources that their peers have access to. Certainly not access to many of the extracurricular activities that their peers have access to. And they don't have access to perhaps a mother who has a college degree, might even be a teacher and can invest herself in that child to develop them. Perhaps the parents are just trying to survive.
Adi, we're at 10 minutes.
So the Tinsley student that I interviewed, just want to leave you with this, said she wished that people could understand that her mother was as devoted to her as other parents were devoted to their children. And she wished that people could see that there was value in her exchange, that she had something to offer, and they had something to learn from her, and that her life had value. And I'm just going to leave you with this last thought, that unless you look at education as a function of our society, as a function of something that we are willing to accept, that stratification, that yes, we do have access, but we don't have equal schools, then you're missing the point. You have to equalize not only access, but equal resources. And Lemery argued that someone has to fail. But if you allow people to fail, that's going to affect society. And you've now decided you are not going to invest in society, yet you live in the society. So you should invest in these communities. So it's not as easy as I got into Stanford because of my intelligence, maybe largely due to the fact that your parents had college degrees, that you lived in certain communities, that you had access to certain resources. It's a function of investment. Thank you.
Thank you, Adi.